The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly maintained lawn of the Barrett mansion as Margaret Johnson walked up the curved driveway. Her sensible black shoes clicked against the concrete with each confident step. At 45 years old, Margaret carried herself with the quiet dignity that came from 2 decades of professional housekeeping experience. She paused for a moment to straighten her navy blue uniform, making sure every detail was perfect. This was her first day working for Richard Barrett, and first impressions mattered. The employment agency had warned her that Mr. Barrett was particular about his house, but Margaret wasn't worried. She had worked for many demanding clients over the years. When she rang the doorbell, Margaret heard heavy footsteps approaching. The massive wooden door swung open to reveal Richard Barrett, a tall man in his late 60s with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes. He looked down at Margaret with an expression that immediately made her heart sink. "You're the new housekeeper?" he asked, his voice filled with obvious disappointment. His eyes traveled from her face to her uniform and back again, making no attempt to hide his disapproval. "Yes, sir. I'm Margaret Johnson from Elite Housekeeping Services. I have 20 years of experience and I—" "Just come in." Barrett cut her off, turning his back and walking into the house. "Try not to touch anything except what you're cleaning." Margaret took a deep breath and followed him inside. The house was impressive, a 3-story mansion filled with expensive furniture and artwork, but there was something cold about it, as if no one really lived there. No family photos on the walls, no books left open on tables, no signs of daily life. "The cleaning supplies are in here," Barrett said, opening a door to reveal a well-stocked supply closet. "I expect everything to be exactly where I left it when you're done using them." "Of course, sir. I always—" "And I'll be watching to make sure nothing disappears," he added, giving her another suspicious look. "I've had problems with housekeepers before." Margaret felt her face grow hot, but she kept her expression neutral. In 20 years, no one had ever accused her of stealing. She had letters of recommendation from dozens of satisfied clients, including judges and business executives. But she could tell that none of that mattered to Barrett. He had already decided what kind of person she was. "I'll start with the living room," Margaret said professionally, gathering her supplies. As she worked, Barrett followed her from room to room, watching her every move. He stood in doorways with his arms crossed, making small sounds of disapproval whenever she touched anything valuable. When she carefully picked up a crystal vase to dust underneath it, he practically jumped forward. "Be careful with that. It's worth more than you make in a year," he snapped. "I understand, sir," Margaret replied calmly, though her hands were shaking slightly. She had handled priceless antiques before, but never under such intense scrutiny. Throughout the morning, Barrett's comments grew increasingly hostile. When Margaret pulled out her phone to check the time, he immediately accused her of trying to take pictures of his valuables. When she spent extra time carefully cleaning around some delicate decorative pieces, he suggested she was being slow on purpose to milk more hours. But it was during her lunch break that things reached a breaking point. Margaret had brought her own lunch in a neat paper bag, planning to eat quietly in the kitchen as she usually did with clients. But Barrett came in just as she was unwrapping her sandwich. "Not in here," he said sharply. "You can eat in the backyard." Margaret looked out the window. It was starting to rain. "Sir, I don't mean to be difficult, but it's raining outside. I always eat my lunch very carefully and clean up completely afterward." "I said not in here," Barrett repeated, his voice rising. "I don't want food smells in my kitchen. The back porch has an overhang. That should be good enough." Margaret quietly wrapped up her sandwich and walked to the back porch. As she sat on the cold concrete steps, partially sheltered from the rain, she pulled out her phone and called her daughter Rachel. "How's the new job, Mom?" Rachel asked cheerfully. Margaret watched raindrops fall on her sandwich wrapper. "It's challenging, baby. But you know what your father always said. Every difficult person is just someone whose story we don't know yet. You want to quit? You don't have to put up with." "No," Margaret said firmly, thinking of Rachel's medical school tuition. "I've handled worse. Sometimes people just need time to see past their own prejudices. I'll be fine." As she ended the call, Margaret saw Barrett watching her through the kitchen window. His face was unreadable, but for a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, perhaps surprised that she was making a phone call rather than stealing his silverware. Margaret straightened her back and unwrapped her sandwich. She had faced people like Barrett before, and she would face them again. Her dignity wasn't determined by how others treated her, but by how she chose to carry herself. With that thought, she finished her lunch and went back inside, ready to face whatever the afternoon might bring. The following week, Margaret was cleaning the dusty shelves in Barrett's study when she found something interesting. Behind a row of leather-bound books was an old photo album that had slipped down behind the others. When she pulled it out to dust underneath, it fell open, and several photographs spilled onto the floor. As Margaret quickly gathered the photos, one image caught her eye. It showed a much younger Richard Barrett, probably in his 20s, standing with a group of people at what looked like a civil rights march. He was holding a sign that read "Equal Rights Now" and smiling broadly at the camera. Next to him stood a beautiful woman with kind eyes who must have been his wife. "What are you doing?" Margaret jumped at Barrett's sharp voice behind her. She turned to find him glaring at her from the doorway. "I'm sorry, sir. The album fell when I was dusting, and I was just picking up the photos," she explained calmly, though her heart was racing. Barrett strode across the room and snatched the photos from her hands. But as he did, he caught sight of the image she had been looking at. For a moment, he froze, staring at the young man he used to be. "Get out," he said quietly, still looking at the photo. "Just get out of this room." Margaret quickly gathered her cleaning supplies and left, but not before she saw Barrett sink heavily into his leather chair, the photo trembling slightly in his hands. Later that afternoon, Margaret was weeding the small garden in the backyard when she heard someone call her name. It was Mrs. Henderson, Barrett's next-door neighbor, an elderly woman who often worked in her own garden. "Come have some lemonade, dear," Mrs. Henderson called over the fence. "You look like you could use a break." Margaret glanced at the house, making sure Barrett wasn't watching, then walked over to the fence. Mrs. Henderson handed her a cold glass of lemonade. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. This is very kind of you. Call me Betty, please." The older woman smiled kindly. "I've been watching how Richard treats you. He wasn't always like this, you know." Margaret thought about the photo she had found. "I saw an old picture today, from a civil rights march." Betty nodded. "Oh yes, Richard and Helen. That was his wife. They were very active in the movement. They met at a protest rally, actually. Helen was a high school teacher, taught African American history. She would be heartbroken to see how he's changed." "What happened?" Margaret asked softly. "Helen died 5 years ago. Cancer." Betty sighed. "They were married for 40 years. Did everything together. After she passed, Richard just shut down. Stopped going to community meetings, stopped having Sunday dinners with his family, started pushing everyone away, even fired his old housekeeper, Maria, who had worked for them for 15 years. As Betty talked, Margaret remembered how she had felt after losing her own husband, James, to a heart attack 3 years ago. The pain had been overwhelming. For months, she had barely been able to get out of bed. But Rachel had needed her, and slowly, she had found her way back to life. "The worst part," Betty continued, "is that he's gotten so bitter. The Richard I knew was passionate about justice, about treating everyone with dignity. Helen always said he had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever met. Now," she shook her head sadly. Suddenly, they heard Barrett's voice from the house. "Is the garden not keeping you busy enough?" Margaret quickly thanked Betty for the lemonade and hurried back to her weeding, but as she worked, she thought about what she had learned. The angry man who watched her every move wasn't the real Richard Barrett. He was someone lost in grief, who had forgotten who he used to be. That evening, as Margaret cleaned the kitchen, she heard Barrett in his study again. This time, he wasn't arguing on the phone. Instead, she could hear him crying softly. She paused in her work, the sound tugging at her heart. Through the partially open door, she could see him sitting at his desk, looking at the old photo album. For a moment, Margaret considered going in to check on him, but she knew he wasn't ready for that kind of kindness yet, especially not from her. Instead, she quietly finished her work, leaving a fresh cup of tea on his desk before she left, just as she did every evening. Only this time, she also left a single tissue beside it. When she came back the next morning, Margaret noticed 2 things. The teacup was empty, and the tissue was gone. It was a hot afternoon, and Margaret was cleaning the study windows when she heard a crash from the kitchen. At first, She thought Barrett had dropped something and was about to rush in to help clean up before he could complain about the mess. But then she heard a different sound, a groan of pain that made her blood run cold. Margaret ran to the kitchen and found Barrett on the floor. He was clutching his chest, his face pale and covered in sweat. A broken glass of water lay scattered around him, the liquid spreading across the tile floor. "Mr. Barrett." Margaret rushed to his side, careful to avoid the broken glass. "Can you hear me?" He tried to speak but could only gasp for air. His blue eyes were wide with fear, and his left hand was gripping his chest so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Margaret didn't hesitate. During James's illness, she had taken a basic medical training course to help care for him at home. She quickly recognized the signs of a heart attack, the chest pain, shortness of breath, and the way Barrett's left arm was starting to shake. "I'm calling an ambulance," she said firmly, pulling out her phone. As she dialed 911, she helped Barrett into a more comfortable position on the floor, supporting his head with a folded kitchen towel. 911, what's your emergency? Possible heart attack at 1542 Oak Grove Road. Margaret spoke clearly. Male patient, late 60s, showing chest pain and difficulty breathing. While she talked to the dispatcher, Margaret kept her free hand on Barrett's shoulder, partly to comfort him and partly to monitor his breathing. His eyes were fixed on her face, and she could see the fear in them, but also something else. Surprise, maybe, at how quickly and calmly she had taken charge. "Help is coming," she told him softly. "Try to take slow, steady breaths. I'm right here with you." Barrett managed to whisper something. Margaret leaned closer to hear. "Why?" he gasped. "Why are you helping me? After how I—" Margaret interrupted gently. "Don't try to talk. Just focus on breathing. We can discuss everything else later." She remembered the dispatcher's instructions and began counting Barrett's breaths, keeping track of time on her phone. His breathing was shallow and irregular, but at least he was conscious. In the distance, she could hear sirens approaching. "Helen." Barrett whispered suddenly, his eyes becoming unfocused. "Helen, I'm sorry." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Stay with me, Mr. Barrett. The ambulance is almost here." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Paramedics rushed in, asking questions that Margaret answered as clearly as she could. Yes, she had found him about 10 minutes ago. Yes, he had been conscious the whole time. No, she wasn't family, but she knew his daughter's phone number. As they loaded Barrett onto a stretcher, Margaret quickly called Sarah using the business card she had kept in her uniform pocket. "Sarah, this is Margaret, your father's housekeeper. Your father's had a heart attack. They're taking him to Memorial Hospital." Yes, he was conscious when they loaded him in the ambulance. "I'll stay here until you arrive." After hanging up, Margaret looked around the kitchen. There was still broken glass on the floor, and water had spread everywhere. She should clean it up. It was her job, after all. But something made her hesitate. She walked to the front window instead and watched the ambulance disappear down the street, its sirens fading into the distance. The last glimpse she had caught of Barrett's face stuck in her mind. Just before they had loaded him into the ambulance, he had reached out and grabbed her hand. "Thank you," he had whispered. Just 2 simple words, but they were the first kind words he had spoken to her since she started working there. Margaret touched her phone in her pocket, thinking of how she should call Rachel. Her daughter would want to know what had happened. But she also knew what Rachel would say, that maybe this was a good time to quit, to find another job with a kinder employer. But as Margaret finally turned to clean up the broken glass, she knew she wouldn't quit. Not now. Something had changed in that moment on the kitchen floor, when Barrett had looked at her not as someone to be suspicious of, but as a human being who was trying to help him. She had seen through his mask of anger to the scared, lonely man underneath. And maybe, just maybe, he had finally seen her too. The hospital waiting room was quiet except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes on the linoleum floor. Margaret sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, her hands folded in her lap. She had debated whether to come to the hospital at all, but something told her she should be there. Sarah Barrett sat across from her, looking exhausted. She had arrived at the house just as Margaret finished cleaning up the broken glass, and had insisted that Margaret come with her to the hospital. "The doctor said you probably saved his life," Sarah said quietly. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't acted so quickly. She didn't finish the sentence. Margaret shifted in her chair. I just did what anyone would do. No, Sarah shook her head. Not everyone would have helped him so quickly, especially not after how he's treated you. Mom used to say that you can judge a person's character by how they treat those who have been unkind to them. Before Margaret could respond, a doctor appeared in the doorway. Miss Barrett? Sarah stood up quickly. Yes? How is my father? He's stable now, the doctor said. It was a moderate heart attack. We've cleared the blockage, and he's responding well to treatment. He's awake and asking for someone named Margaret. Sarah turned to Margaret with surprise. Margaret felt her own face flush with confusion. After a moment's hesitation, she stood up. The doctor led them down a long hallway to Barrett's room. He looked small and vulnerable in the hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines. His usual stern expression was gone, replaced by something softer, more uncertain. Margaret, he said weakly when he saw her. You stayed. Yes, sir, she replied quietly. Could you? He glanced at Sarah, then back to Margaret. Could you come closer? I need to tell you something. Margaret walked to the side of his bed. Barrett's hand trembled as he reached out and took hers. His palm was cool and dry against her skin. I remember, he said slowly, when I was lying on that kitchen floor, thinking I was going to die. And you were there, helping me, talking to me, even after all the terrible ways I treated you. His voice cracked. You reminded me of Helen. Sarah made a small sound, and Margaret saw tears in her eyes. Helen would have done exactly what you did, Barrett continued. She always saw the best in people, even when they were at their worst. I've forgotten that these past few years. Forgotten everything she taught me about kindness, about justice. He squeezed Margaret's hand. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for how I've treated you. Margaret felt tears welling up in her own eyes. Mr. Barrett. Please, he interrupted. Call me Richard. A nurse appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry, but Mr. Barrett needs to rest now. As Margaret turned to leave, Barrett held onto her hand for a moment longer. Will you? He hesitated. Will you still come to work tomorrow? Of course, Margaret said softly. Someone needs to dust those windows properly. For the first time since she had known him, Barrett smiled. It was a small smile, weak and hesitant, but it transformed his whole face. For a moment, she could see the young man from the protest photo, the one who had fought for equality and justice. In the hallway, Sarah hugged Margaret tightly. Thank you, she whispered. Not just for saving his life, but for helping him remember who he used to be. That evening, as Margaret drove home, she thought about how quickly life could change. This morning, she had been dreading another day of Barrett's cruel comments and suspicious glares. Now she had seen a completely different side of him, one that had been buried under years of grief and bitterness. When she called Rachel to tell her what had happened, her daughter was quiet for a long moment. Mom, Rachel finally said, remember what you told me about Dad's favorite saying? About how every difficult person is just someone whose story we don't know yet? Yes, baby. I think maybe you just learned Mr. Barrett's story. Margaret smiled as she looked out her window at the setting sun. Yes, she said softly. I think I did. A week later, Barrett returned home from the hospital. The house had changed during his absence. Sarah had opened all the windows, letting fresh air and sunlight stream in. There were flowers on the tables and family photos back on the walls, but the biggest change was in Barrett himself. Margaret noticed it as soon as she arrived for work that first morning. Barrett was sitting in the living room, looking through the old photo album she had found in the study. When she started to quietly clean around him, he looked up with an expression she had never seen before, uncertainty. Margaret, he said, his voice still a bit weak. Would you like to see these? She paused, duster in hand. Are you sure, Mr. Barrett? Richard, he corrected gently. And yes, I'm sure. Please sit. Margaret carefully sat on the edge of the sofa. Barrett, Richard, turned the album so she could see. The first photo showed him and Helen on their wedding day, both young and beaming with happiness. We met at a protest rally in 1965, he said softly. I was trying to look important, carrying a big sign and shouting slogans. Helen was the one actually doing the real work, handing out water to people, helping elderly protesters find shade. He smiled at the memory. She taught African American history at the local high school, fought for years to get more diverse authors included in the curriculum. As he turned the pages, Margaret saw photos of their life together, protest marches, community meetings, family picnics. In every picture, Helen's warm smile lit up her face. She would have been so ashamed of how I've acted these past few years, Richard said quietly. After she died, I couldn't bear to look at these photos anymore. Couldn't bear to remember the person I used to be, the things we believed in together. His hands trembled slightly as he turned another page. It was easier to be angry than to feel the pain. Margaret thought about her own grief after losing James. Sometimes, she said carefully, when we lose someone we love, it feels like we lose part of ourselves too. We have to find our way back slowly. Richard looked at her with surprise. Sarah mentioned that you lost your husband. Margaret nodded. 3 years ago. Heart attack, like yours. She smiled sadly. That's why I knew what to do when I found you in the kitchen. James's doctor made sure I learned all the warning signs, how to do CPR, everything. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding between them. Tell me about him, Richard asked softly. Margaret found herself talking about James, his love of jazz music, his terrible jokes, the way he had supported her decision to start her own housekeeping business. As she talked, Richard listened with genuine interest, occasionally sharing his own memories of Helen. The morning passed quickly, the cleaning forgotten as they shared stories of their lost loved ones. Around noon, Sarah arrived with lunch and found them still sitting there, the photo album between them. Dad, she said hesitantly from the doorway, is everything okay? Richard looked up, and Margaret saw tears in his eyes. But he was smiling. Yes, sweetheart. Margaret was just telling me about her husband. Did you know he used to play saxophone in a jazz band? Sarah's face lit up with surprise and joy at seeing her father engaged in real conversation, showing interest in someone else's life. She joined them, bringing the lunch into the living room, something that would have been unthinkable just a week ago. As they ate, Richard suddenly turned to Margaret. I've been thinking, he said. The community center where Helen and I used to volunteer. They're always looking for help. Would you be willing to come with me sometime? When I'm stronger? Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. She remembered Helen's photo from the protest rally, her kind eyes and determined smile. I'd like that, she said softly. Sarah reached over and squeezed her father's hand. Outside, the spring sunshine streamed through the open windows, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. It sounded like hope. 1 month after his heart attack, Richard Barrett stood in front of his hallway mirror, adjusting his tie with slightly shaky hands. It was Sunday morning, and for the first time in 5 years, he was getting ready for family dinner at Sarah's house. Margaret arrived early that day, as she had been doing since his return from the hospital. These days, she spent less time cleaning and more time helping Richard regain his strength. The doctor had insisted he have someone nearby during his recovery, and Sarah had arranged for Margaret to work extra hours. You look nice, Margaret said as she walked in, carrying a small bag of groceries. The grandchildren will be excited to see you. Richard turned from the mirror, his face nervous. It's been so long. What if they're afraid of me? I was so different before. Children are more forgiving than we think, Margaret replied, remembering how quickly her own grandchildren had welcomed her back into their lives after her period of grief. Just be the person you are now. As she put away the groceries, Margaret thought about how much had changed in the past month. The house felt different, warmer, more alive. Family photos covered the walls again, and Sarah visited almost daily. Even Mrs. Henderson from next door had started bringing over her famous lemon squares. But the biggest change was in Richard himself. The bitter, suspicious man who had once followed her around the house was gone. In his place was someone who asked about her day, who shared stories about Helen, who actually noticed when she looked tired and insisted she take breaks. Margaret, Richard called from the hallway. Could you come here for a moment? She found him standing by the study door, holding a folder. I've been thinking, he said, his voice serious, about what you said regarding your daughter's medical school tuition. Margaret felt her face grow warm. She hadn't meant to mention her struggles with Rachel's tuition during their conversations, but it had slipped out one day. I want to help, Richard continued, opening the folder. Helen and I. We set up a scholarship fund years ago at the local medical school. It's been sitting unused since she died. I'd like to restart it, with Rachel as the first recipient. Margaret stared at him, speechless. Mr. Barrett, Richard. I couldn't possibly. Please, he interrupted gently. Helen would have wanted this. She always believed in helping young people achieve their dreams. And after what you did for me? His voice cracked slightly. You didn't just save my life that day in the kitchen. You helped me find my way back to who I used to be. Tears filled Margaret's eyes. Before she could respond, the doorbell rang. Through the window, they could see Sarah's car in the driveway, 3 excited children bouncing in the back seat. We'll talk more about this later, Richard said, squeezing her hand. Right now, I have some grandchildren to reconnect with. Margaret watched from the kitchen as Sarah and her family came in. The youngest grandchild, a little girl of about 5, ran straight to Richard and hugged his legs. Grandpa, Mommy said you were sick, but now you're better. Richard knelt down carefully, his eyes shining. Yes, sweetheart. I am much better now, and I've missed you very much. As the family moved to the living room, Margaret heard the children's excited voices mixing with Richard's warm laughter. She thought about calling Rachel to tell her about the scholarship, but decided to wait. Some moments needed to be savored first. Later that afternoon, as Richard prepared to leave for Sarah's house, he turned to Margaret. Would you like to join us? Sarah always makes too much food, and the children would love to meet you. Margaret hesitated. Are you sure? It's a family dinner. Yes, Richard said firmly. You are family now. You and Rachel both. He smiled, and Margaret saw in his face the man from the old photographs, the one who had fought for justice and equality, who had believed in bringing people together. As they drove to Sarah's house, Margaret thought about how life could surprise you. Sometimes the biggest changes came from the most unexpected places, and sometimes it took almost losing everything to remember who you really were. 6 months after Richard Barrett's heart attack, the community center was buzzing with activity. It was the first meeting of the Helen Barrett Memorial Mentorship Program, and the room was filled with young students and volunteer tutors. Richard stood at the podium, his hands steady now as he adjusted the microphone. Margaret sat in the front row beside Rachel, who had taken a weekend off from medical school to attend. Sarah and her family were there too, along with Mrs. Henderson and many of the neighbors who had watched Richard's transformation over the past months. Helen always believed that education could break down barriers, Richard began, his voice strong and clear. She knew that when people from different backgrounds came together to learn from each other, prejudice couldn't survive. I forgot that for a while after she died. I built walls around myself, pushed people away, let bitterness take over. He paused, looking at Margaret. But sometimes life sends us exactly the person we need to help us remember who we are. Margaret Johnson didn't just save my life that day in my kitchen. She saved my soul by showing me kindness when I least deserved it. Margaret felt Rachel squeeze her hand as Richard continued. That's why this mentorship program isn't just about tutoring. It's about bringing people together, breaking down the barriers we build between us. Every student here will be paired with someone from a different background, a different life experience. Because that's how we grow, that's how we learn, that's how we become better. After the speech, as people mingled and enjoyed refreshments, Margaret watched Richard talking with the students. He was different now. The warm, passionate man from Helen's photographs had fully returned. The angry mask had fallen away completely. Your mom is amazing, one of Rachel's classmates said. She was one of the 5 medical students who had received scholarships from the newly revived Helen Barrett Fund. I wouldn't have been able to continue medical school without this scholarship. Rachel beamed with pride. She taught me that every person deserves a chance to be understood, even the ones who seem the most difficult. Later that evening, Richard hosted a small dinner at his house, something that had become a weekly tradition. Sarah and her family were there, along with Margaret, Rachel, and Mrs. Henderson. The house was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. As Margaret helped Richard serve dessert, he pulled her aside. I have something to show you, he said, leading her to the study. On his desk was a framed photograph. It showed Richard at the community center's opening day, surrounded by the scholarship recipients. Next to it was the old photo from the Civil Rights March, where he stood with Helen. Helen would have loved you, Richard said softly. She would have seen what I didn't see at first, your strength, your dignity, your capacity for forgiveness. Margaret touched the frame gently. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, and she would have been so happy to see how things have turned out. Richard turned to Margaret with tears in his eyes. I know I've said it before, but I need to say it again. I'm sorry for how I treated you when you first came to work here. I was so lost in my pain that I became someone Helen would have been ashamed of. The past is the past, Margaret said kindly. What matters is who you are now. From the dining room, they heard the sound of Sarah's children laughing, mixed with Rachel's voice as she told them a story. Mrs. Henderson was sharing her latest recipe with Sarah, and the whole house felt alive with joy. You know, Richard said thoughtfully, I used to think I was alone after Helen died, but I wasn't. I just couldn't see the people who were trying to reach out to me. Sometimes it takes a crisis to open our eyes. Margaret smiled, and sometimes it takes a heart attack to heal a heart. Richard laughed, a warm, genuine laugh that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Helen would have loved that line. They returned to the dining room, where Rachel was showing Sarah's children pictures from her medical school. The youngest girl was sitting on Mrs. Henderson's lap, helping her arrange cookies on a plate. The scene was so different from the cold, silent house Margaret had first walked into all those months ago. As she looked around at these people who had become like family, Margaret remembered something James used to say, grace isn't just about forgiveness, it's about transformation. She watched Richard joining in the children's laughter and knew that both kinds of grace had been at work here. Some stories, she thought, don't end with dramatic changes or grand gestures. They end with quiet transformations, with hearts opening slowly, like flowers turning toward the sun. They end with the simple truth that love and kindness can break down any wall, heal any heart, and bridge any divide if we just give them a chance.